September 8, 1941. The last road out of Leningrad was cut. German and Finnish forces had completely encircled the Soviet Union's second-largest city, trapping nearly 3 million people, soldiers and civilians, inside a ring of steel. What followed was 872 days of unimaginable horror, the longest and most destructive siege in modern history. Over 1 million people would die, most from starvation. This is the story of how an entire city became a circle of hell on earth, where the living envied the dead, where humanity itself was tested to its absolute breaking point. Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, was one of the Soviet Union's crown jewels. Founded by Peter the Great, it had been Russia's capital for 2 centuries. It was a city of magnificent palaces, world-class museums, theaters, universities, and factories. 3 million people called it home in 1941. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Leningrad became a primary objective. Hitler wanted the city destroyed, its population exterminated, its very existence erased from history. The German plan was brutally simple: surround the city, cut it off from all supplies, and let starvation do the rest. Hitler explicitly ordered that Leningrad not be captured but destroyed. German forces would not feed the population. No humanitarian aid would be permitted. The city would be bombarded continuously until nothing remained. Then, the rubble would be bulldozed and the site abandoned. 3 million people were condemned to death by deliberate policy. The encirclement closed on September 8. German forces from the south and Finnish forces from the north met, severing all land connections to the rest of the Soviet Union. The only link remaining was across Lake Ladoga, a large body of water east of the city. In summer, boats could cross. In winter, when the lake froze solid, trucks could drive across the ice. This tenuous connection, later called the Road of Life, would be Leningrad's only supply line for nearly 900 days. The first winter was apocalyptic. Food supplies in the city were never adequate for a long siege. Soviet authorities had not stockpiled sufficient reserves, believing the war would be fought far from Leningrad. By November 1941, with winter setting in and supply routes across Lake Ladoga proving inadequate, the food situation became catastrophic. Rations were cut repeatedly. By late November, civilians received 125 grams of bread per day, a piece roughly the size of a deck of cards. That was it. That was the entire daily food ration for non-working civilians. The bread itself was barely recognizable as bread. It contained perhaps 10% flour. The rest was sawdust, cellulose, cottonseed cake, and anything else that could be mixed in to provide bulk and a few calories. It tasted terrible and provided minimal nutrition, but it was all there was. People ate it slowly, savoring every crumb, knowing that when it was gone, there would be no more food until tomorrow's ration, if they survived until tomorrow. Starvation came for Leningrad's population with methodical cruelty. The process of starving to death is not quick or peaceful. First comes constant gnawing hunger, every waking moment dominated by thoughts of food. Then weakness sets in as the body begins consuming its own muscle tissue for energy. Walking becomes difficult. Stairs become mountains. Simple tasks require rest breaks. The cold penetrates deeper because the body lacks energy to maintain warmth. Mental function deteriorates, confusion, inability to concentrate, memory loss. Diarist Vera Inber, who lived through the siege, described what she saw daily. People fall in the street and cannot rise. They sit on the ground and die sitting up. Others step around them, lacking the strength to help or even care. The dead lie in the streets for days because there is no one strong enough to collect them. Bodies are stacked like cordwood at cemeteries, waiting for mass graves to be dug by workers too weak to hold their shovels properly. The death rate in December 1941 and January 1942 was staggering. Over 100,000 people died in December, over 200,000 in January. nearly 100,000 in February. These numbers represent individual human tragedies multiplied beyond comprehension. Each death was a person with a name, a family, a life. They died in their apartments, in their beds, in the streets, at their workstations. They died so quickly that the living could not keep up with the dead. Tanya Savasheva was an 11-year-old girl who kept a diary during the siege. Her entries were brief, heartbreaking, and became one of the most famous documents of the siege. Zhenya died on December 28 at 12:30 p.m., 1941. Grandma died on January 25 at 3 p.m., 1942. Leka died on March 17 at 5 a.m., 1942. Uncle Vasya died on April 13 at 2 a.m., 1942. Uncle Lyosha on May 10 at 4 p.m., 1942. Mama on May 13 at 7:30 a.m., 1942. The Savashevs are dead. Everyone is dead. Only Tanya is left. Tanya herself died in 1944, never fully recovering from the starvation she endured. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical. Leningrad became a city where normal human emotions and social bonds broke down under the pressure of survival. Parents watched their children die, unable to help. Children watched their parents grow weaker daily, knowing what was coming. Families made impossible decisions about who would receive the larger portion of food, who had the best chance of survival, who would be sacrificed so others might live. Reports emerged, suppressed during the Soviet era but documented in NKVD files, of cannibalism. When all food was exhausted, when pets had been eaten, when leather belts and shoes had been boiled for whatever nutrients they might contain, some people crossed the final taboo. The NKVD arrested over 2,000 people for cannibalism during the siege. Most cases involved people eating the dead. Some cases involved murder for food. These were not monsters but ordinary people driven to ultimate desperation by starvation. Dmitry Lazarev, an NKVD officer who investigated these cases, later wrote, "I do not judge them. I cannot. I was not starving as they were. I had access to slightly better rations because of my position. If I had been in their situation, who knows what I would have done? Starvation destroys the mind as surely as it destroys the body. It reduces people to pure survival instinct. We arrested them because we had to maintain order, but I understood. God help me, I understood." Yet alongside this horror, acts of extraordinary humanity also occurred. Teachers continued teaching in unheated schools, though they were too weak to stand for long. Musicians performed concerts, including the famous premiere of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony in August 1942, performed by an orchestra whose members were literally starving. Doctors treated patients despite having no medicines and barely enough strength to walk. People shared their meager rations with neighbors who had nothing. Humanity persisted even in hell. The road of life across Lake Ladoga was Leningrad's only lifeline, and it was desperately inadequate. In autumn 1941, before the lake froze, boats carried supplies across under constant German air attack. Many boats were sunk. The tonnage delivered was far below the city's needs. When the lake froze in November, trucks began making the crossing on ice. It was incredibly dangerous. The ice was often thin. Trucks broke through and sank. German artillery targeted the route, but it continued operating because it was the only option. Truck driver Viktor Alexeyev made dozens of crossings on the ice road during the winter of 1941–42. Every trip, you wondered if you would make it across. The ice cracked and groaned under the weight. You could see trucks that had broken through, their cabs protruding from the ice like grave markers. We drove as fast as we dared, knowing that stopping meant death. German planes strafed us constantly. Artillery fire created geysers of ice and water. But we kept driving because people in Leningrad were dying, and every sack of flour we delivered meant someone might live another day. The quantities delivered across the ice road gradually increased as Soviet logistics improved and more trucks were assigned to the route. By early 1942, enough food was reaching the city to slowly increase rations. It wasn't enough to end starvation, but it was enough to slow the death rate. The worst was over by spring 1942, though over is relative. People continued dying of starvation throughout 1942 and 1943, just at lower rates than the horrific winter of 1941–42. German bombardment added to the suffering. Artillery shelled the city daily, thousands of rounds falling on residential areas, factories, hospitals. The Germans weren't targeting military objectives, they were targeting the population, trying to maximize civilian deaths and suffering. Air raids added to the bombardment, though Soviet air defenses gradually became more effective at shooting down German bombers. The psychological effect of constant bombardment, combined with starvation, created unimaginable stress. Nurse Yelena Kachina described working in a hospital during the siege. We had no heat, no light except candles, no medicines, barely any food. Patients came in starving, wounded, frostbitten. We could do almost nothing for them. They died in their beds, sometimes in the middle of the night, and we wouldn't discover them until morning because we had no strength to check on them constantly. I felt like I was presiding over a morgue rather than a hospital. The guilt of being unable to help haunts me still, decades later. Children suffered disproportionately. Young bodies need more calories for growth and have less fat reserves to sustain them during starvation. Mortality rates among children were catastrophic. Orphanages filled with children whose parents had died, but the orphanages themselves lacked food. Many children simply stopped speaking, stopped playing, stopped being children. They sat silently, conserving energy, waiting for the end. Some orphans were evacuated across the ice road, but many died before evacuation was possible. The siege also destroyed Leningrad's cultural heritage. Museums were damaged by bombing. Palaces in the suburbs, including the magnificent Catherine Palace with its famous amber room, were deliberately vandalized and looted by German forces. German soldiers stole art, destroyed furniture, and used the palaces as barracks. The Amber Room, one of the wonders of the world, was disassembled and shipped to Germany, where it disappeared. Centuries of Russian culture were obliterated by the war. Soviet authorities maintained strict control throughout the siege. The NKVD arrested anyone suspected of defeatism, panic-mongering, or insufficient patriotic enthusiasm. Public discussion of the true scale of starvation was forbidden. Such talk could harm morale. Ration card theft was punished by execution. Black market food trading was harshly suppressed. The Soviet state remained totalitarian even as it was dying. Perhaps the control was necessary to prevent complete social collapse, or perhaps it was simply reflexive authoritarianism. Probably both. Factory workers continued producing weapons and ammunition despite starvation. The Kirov plant kept manufacturing tanks throughout the siege. Workers who could barely stand operated lathes and assembly lines, producing the T-34 tanks that the Red Army desperately needed. Many workers died at their stations, literally working until they collapsed. The weapons they produced helped the Soviet Union survive the war, but the cost in human lives was almost beyond calculation. The summer of 1942 brought slight relief. With Lake Ladoga navigable by boat again, supply deliveries increased significantly. A fuel pipeline was laid across the lake bed, providing oil for heating and industry. Rations increased to levels that allowed survival, though not comfort. The death rate dropped from its winter peak. People began to hope they might actually survive. But the siege continued, the bombardment continued, and people continued dying, just not at the apocalyptic rates of that first winter. In January 1943, Soviet forces launched Operation Iskra Spark, a massive offensive to break the blockade. After a week of intense fighting, they opened a narrow land corridor to Leningrad. It was only about 10 kilometers wide and was under constant German artillery fire, but it allowed railway connections to be established. Supplies could now reach the city by rail, albeit dangerously. The worst of the siege was over, though the city remained under threat and bombardment continued. The siege was finally lifted completely on January 27, 1944, when Soviet forces drove the Germans back and eliminated the encirclement. After 872 days, Leningrad was free. The surviving population, those who hadn't died, hadn't been evacuated, emerged from their ordeal fundamentally changed. They had endured something that broke many of them psychologically. Survivors suffered from what we now call PTSD. They had nightmares about starvation for decades. They hoarded food compulsively. They could never feel truly safe again. The death toll has been extensively debated by historians. Soviet official figures claimed 632,000 deaths, but this was clearly a massive undercount. Modern historians estimate between 1.1 and 1.5 million deaths during the siege, roughly one-third to one-half of the population. The vast majority died of starvation. Others died from German bombardment, cold, disease, or the general breakdown of health that starvation causes. It was one of the greatest human catastrophes of World War II. Survivors carried guilt for the rest of their lives. Guilt for surviving when others didn't. Guilt for decisions they made, who got extra food, who didn't. Guilt for things they did to survive that violated peacetime morality. Lydia Ginsburg, a writer who survived the siege, wrote, "We who survived cannot judge those who died or those who did terrible things to survive. We do not know what we would have done in their exact circumstances." The siege showed us that civilization is a thin veneer over the survival instinct. When that veneer is stripped away by extreme circumstances, we are all capable of both terrible things and extraordinary goodness. The children who survived the siege carried physical and psychological damage throughout their lives. Many had stunted growth from malnutrition during critical developmental years. They had weakened immune systems, damaged organs, chronic health problems. Psychologically, they had been robbed of their childhoods, exposed to death and horror no child should witness. Soviet authorities eventually recognized siege survivors as a special category requiring medical care and support, but no amount of support could fully heal those wounds. The world learned about the siege slowly. During the war, Soviet censorship minimized reporting on the catastrophe. After the war, Cold War politics meant Western audiences heard relatively little about Leningrad's suffering. It wasn't until decades later that the full horror became widely known through survivor memoirs, academic studies, and the opening of Soviet archives. The siege became recognized as one of history's great atrocities, not a war crime in the legal sense, since sieges were technically legal, but certainly a moral crime of staggering proportions. Hitler's deliberate policy of starving Leningrad represented genocidal intent. He wanted the population dead, wanted the city destroyed, wanted it erased from history. The German military leadership accepted this policy and implemented it. Wehrmacht soldiers enforced the blockade knowing that millions were starving behind the lines. Some German officers expressed moral qualms, but none refused to follow orders. The siege stands alongside the Holocaust as evidence of Nazi Germany's fundamental evil. Yet Leningrad refused to die. Despite everything, starvation, bombardment, cold, disease, death on a scale almost incomprehensible, the city survived. Not all its people survived, not by any means. But enough survived to keep the city functioning, to keep the factories running, to keep the culture alive, to maintain hope. That survival, that refusal to surrender even when surrender seemed rational, represents something profound about human resilience. Today, St. Petersburg remembers. Museums document the siege. Monuments honor the dead. The Piskaryevskoye Memorial Cemetery contains mass graves holding 420,000 victims. Each year on January 27, the anniversary of the siege's end, survivors and their descendants gather to remember. The generation that lived through it is nearly gone now. The youngest survivors are in their 80s. Soon there will be no living witnesses to testify about what happened, but the memory must endure. The horrifying reality inside Leningrad's 872-day siege stands as one of history's darkest chapters. It shows the depths of cruelty humans can inflict on each other and the heights of courage humans can display in response. It demonstrates that war's worst victims are often civilians who never asked to fight, never wanted to participate, but found themselves trapped by decisions made by distant leaders. And it proves that even in the most extreme circumstances, when all hope seems lost and death surrounds you, the human spirit can endure. Not everyone survived. Not everyone could. But enough did to tell the story, to warn future generations, to ensure that the million dead of Leningrad are not forgotten. Their suffering must mean something. It must teach us something. It must make us determined that such horror never happens again.